Okay. Am I okay on the mic? Those of you who are at distance can hear me? Okay, good deal. All right, so my name is Marilee Clark. I am the program director for Timpanogos Storytelling Institute. Have any of you ever been to our storytelling festival? Oh, good. We have some storytelling fans. That's excellent. In addition to our annual festival, which happens the weekend after Labor Day at Thanksgiving Point in Lehigh, it's a little plug for our festival. If you haven't been, you really should come. In addition to that, we have a year-long education program where we take professional storytellers into about 80 public and charter schools, grades K through 12, in Utah. This year, so far, since September, we've been down to Monument Valley on the border with Arizona and up to Smithfield on the border with Idaho, and a lot of places in between. So we love what we do. We love taking storytelling, professional storytelling, all over the state of Utah for a lot of reasons. And today, what I'd like to share with you is a little bit of how storytelling can transform all kinds of missions, all kinds of visions, and all kinds of strategies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we do, I want all of you to have the experience of actually experiencing a professional storytelling performance. So we're going to take a little bit of time at the beginning, and you're going to get to listen to a story from one of my favorite storytellers, Bill Lepp. He works mostly, not completely, but mostly in the grand American story form of the tall tale. And it's a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoy it. So those of you who are online, there's a link on one of the slides if you want to go to that. It starts about a minute and 20 seconds into the film. And this is actually on BYU TV, Story Matters. You can find it online. It's free if you want to watch the rest of the stories. They're there for you. So here's Bill Lepp.
There is Bill Lepp with Mayhem dressed as an 8-point buck.
I was sitting in my living room one night. It was 2 in the morning. It's the day before buck season. I was watching a movie on television waiting for the sun to come up so I could go deer hunting when I heard a knock on the back door. Well, I knew not to answer it because I knew if anybody was knocking on my back door at 2 in the morning the day before buck season, it had to be Skeeter. And if Skeeter was knocking on the back door, thank you, at 2 in the morning the day before buck season, he had come up with one of his ideas. And I didn't want to go along with it. Because Skeeter, ever since we were 5, he was having these ideas that, even then, were just barely legal. But I always had to go along with what he said. Having Skeeter for your best friend is sort of like having a head cold for your best friend. Because you never feel right, and he won't go away. There was no free will involved. I was sucked up off the couch. I was drawn to the back door. I opened it up, and there stood Skeeter with a diabolical grin on his face and a paper bag in his hand. And I got a sick feeling way down in my stomach. He didn't say nothing, but I invited him in anyway. It was like letting a vampire into my house. He came in, he sat down at the kitchen table, he put that paper bag on the floor. I went to brew up a pot of cocoa. Finally, Skeeter said to me, he said, "I've been up all night sewing." Well, I wasn't used to my best buddy sewing. I didn't know what to take of that. But he reached down and he opened up that paper bag. He reached in and he pulled out something long and brown and furry. And he sort of flipped it open, pulled it on his head. And by gosh, that kid could sew. What he had made was a perfect replica of an 8-point buck's head. And he said, "Don't worry. I made one for you, too." So there we were, 2 young bucks sitting at the table drinking cocoa. I know, it is an awful joke, but if you'd have thought of it, you'd have put it in your story. But I knew that couldn't be the whole plan, and after a minute, Skeeter said, "That ain't the whole plan." He said, "I also took a mannequin. I dressed him in hunter's orange, and I tied him to the hood of my truck." He said, "What we are going to do is drive around town like it's people season." Now we got one. He said, "We'll drive up to the check-in station, we'll check our cue, and everybody will think it's funny." Well, it was funny. But it's precisely the sort of funny that you don't want your dad to find out that it was you who did it. So we decided to go hide out. We had about 6 hours to kill before dawn. We went up the old service road at the state park. We were sitting there in Skeeter's truck. Skeeter had just got his truck brand new that summer, only had about 80,000 miles on the odometer. But the odometer was in the glove box, mechanically disassociated from every other part of the vehicle. First time I'd ever gone to roll down the passenger side window, I took about a quarter crank on the turn, or a quarter turn on the crank, or a quarter crank on it. It doesn't matter, about a quarter. I went like that, and the window went thump. We never saw it again. Which was fine in the summer because the truck didn't have air conditioning, but that night it was about 20 degrees outside. The wind was blowing right in that window. There was frost building up on both sides of the windshield. We didn't have enough money to buy enough gasoline to run the engine, to run the heater for 6 hours. So we weren't dressed properly. I was freezing to death. Finally, I reached in that bag, pulled out that mask, and put it on. Well, it was warm and cozy inside that mask. Skeeter reached in that bag, pulled out his mask, and put his on. Pretty soon, we fell asleep. When I fell asleep, my head went right out of that open window. And you know how sometimes when you're sleeping, somebody will be doing something around you and your subconscious will pick up on it and sort of yell at you, get up, do something. But other times, maybe like a snake crawled into your bed, your subconscious will just sort of whisper, now, open your eyes, but don't move. Well, that's what my subconscious was telling me. So I just sort of opened my eyes, and sure enough, about 30 yards down the road, there were two bright lights about that far apart, about that high off the ground. The sun was just starting to turn the sky gray. I could barely make out the silhouette of a large American sedan. As the sun came up over the mountaintop, two sunbeams came down the mountain, up that dirt road, over the back of that car, across the top of that car, and one of those sunbeams went through a blue light, and one of those sunbeams went through a red light. The door of that car opened up and Sheriff Hasbro started to get out. Now, Sheriff Hasbro was a big man. He was about 6'8", 6'9", weighed about 480 pounds. But it wasn't all muscle. So it took him a long time to get out of a Ford Tempo. Our county didn't have much of a budget. And while he was getting out of the car, I was poking Skeeter, trying to wake him up. And pretty soon, Sheriff Hasbro was creeping down the road. He had that big flashlight on his shoulder. He was coming in slow. Y'all know that saying, discretion is the better part of valor. Well, Sheriff Hasbro was real into that better part of valor. But I don't want to call the man a coward, because after all, you don't want to just run up on a pickup truck with a guy tied to the hood and two deer sitting in the cab. And I was thinking to myself, the smartest thing to do is to do nothing. But the smartest thing isn't really my strong suit. And I started thinking, how many times in your life do you have the opportunity to scare the pants off the duly elected officials of your county? I don't know if you were ever a teenager in a small town, but if you were, you know that the police don't always have enough to do. So they come looking for you to see what you're doing. And Skeeter and I were conscientious young men, so we endeavored to participate in activities which allowed local law enforcement to practice the skills they had learned at the academy. I thought to myself, I'm just going to make a little deer noise. So I just started went, huh, like that. Well, I'm not saying it was a good deer noise, but it was effective. Sheriff Hasbro, all 6'8", 480 pounds of him, he just left the ground. He jumped so high that Skeeter had time to start the truck, defrost the windshield, and drive underneath of him. We just made our way around that sheriff's car headed on into town. We weren't lawyers, we were 16 years old, right? But we had watched a lot of Starsky and Hutch. And he had never said freeze, he hadn't said you're under arrest. He hadn't read us our rights. How are we supposed to know we were in trouble? Who knew that it was illegal to impersonate a deer? We just headed on into town. Now, the road into $50 West Virginia is pretty straight by West Virginia standards, but it is one of these up and down jobs. And after a little while, we could see that sheriff's car coming up over the hills behind us. He still wasn't gaining on us. I flipped on the CB to hear what was happening, turned it to the police channel, just in time to hear Sheriff Hasbro say, "Tom!" Tom was the deputy. He said, "Tom, I don't care if you think I am crazy. There are 2 deer driving Skeeter Bart's pickup truck down the highway. And I believe they got Skeeter tagged to the hood." And Tom said, "Well, good." You can see where that might hurt our feelings. I just turned off the CB, we headed on into town. But now, this was 1986, this was small town West Virginia, this was before the internet, before CNN. We didn't even get public radio back there in West Virginia. So what people did for their news and information in the morning was turn on their police scanners. So when we came around the corner into Main Street, there were people lined up and down both sides. Drinking cocoa. With their curlers in. I thought Orson Welles was landing spaceships on the courthouse lawn. I turned the CD back on to find out what was going on, just in time to hear Tom say, "Sheriff Hasbro, I called the FBI." Just like you said. And the FBI called Animal Control. And Animal Control said you should consider them 2 deer armed and dangerous. They said you're allowed to use lethal force if necessary. Well, that was a little bit more than we had bargained for, so Skeeter just sort of pulled to the side of the road and Sheriff Hasbro pulled in behind him. And after a minute, Sheriff Hasbro got out of his car, came over and made us take off our masks, and then he yelled at us for a good long time. Gave us each a ticket for the crime of mayhem, dressed as an 8-point buck. We each had to pay a little fine and do a little community service. But I think what we learned from all of this is they say that true forgiveness only comes after you've honestly repented of your sins, after you promise to never do the same thing again, and after you swear to never take any glory from the original action. So I think I can safely say, with that in mind, that Skeeter and I will never be forgiven for what we did that day. Thank you.
All right. That is Bill Lepp. He is one of the smartest men I have ever met in my entire life. Brilliant, brilliant guy. And an incredible storyteller. Should unmute myself. But I wanted to start out with that because I wanted all of you to have the experience of seeing a professional storytelling performance. I wish I could have brought Bill Lepp with you here today because it's even better live. But he's either in West Virginia or somewhere across the great United States. They travel all the time. But, you know, he's a 5-time West Virginia Liars Contest winner, one of the best tall tellers in anywhere, really. In fact, he won that so many times that they told him he couldn't participate anymore and they made him a judge instead. So now he judges. But some of you are probably thinking, well, I'm not a professional storyteller. What does that have to do with me? And I want to start out today with kind of a little bit about that. Because when I go out to schools and talk to kids, they see these professional storytellers perform, and then we talk a little bit about stories and the power of stories. And when I'm talking to the older kids, 6th grade and up, I'll talk with them a little bit about how storytelling can improve your life no matter what you end up doing in your life. Each of you has a mission. You have a reason you're here. I've been to graduate school. I know you have to have a reason to stick it out, right? I mean, it's not easy and it's not always fun. So each of you has a mission. Each of you has something that you're trying to accomplish, that you're learning the skills to be able to accomplish that in the world. Whatever your mission is, I'm here to tell you today that being able to tell a compelling story within the context of that mission is going to make you better at whatever you do. I don't care if you become a professional storyteller, if you become a scientist, if you become a police detective, if you become, for heaven's sakes, a parent, which happens to most of us over the course of our lives. Being able to tell a compelling story is going to make you better at whatever you do. It's going to make you a better influencer. It's kind of a catchword in this age, right? Influencers. If you want to be an influencer, if you want to take your mission and make that mission have impact for a wider and a deeper audience, learn how to tell a compelling story. We're going to talk a little bit today about why that is. Does that sound good to you? All right, let's talk about, maybe we'll just start off with a little agenda. Remember this one? All right, so we're not going to get through all this today, but I want to start out with this idea of why storytelling, why it's going to make you better at whatever you do. We're going to do a little experiment and then talk a little bit about the neuroscience and a little bit about the psychology, both of which you probably are more knowledgeable about than me, but I'm just going to give you some ideas specific to storytelling. We're going to skip the part about benefits for teachers and students because I don't think you really need that. And when we get to the end, if we have enough time, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about how to construct a story that you can work into being a compelling story. So you can tell your own stories and whatever you want to do. So to begin with today, I love this quote. It's from a book by a man named Jonathan Gottschall called The Storytelling Animal. If you want to learn more about this, I would definitely recommend that book. It's a quick read. It's an entertaining read. It's got tons of great information in it. There's another book by a man named Kendall Haven, Haven. It's a book called Story Proof, and he goes through a lot of the research of that as well and can get you started on some of the things we're going to talk about today. But this is one of my absolute favorite quotes from that book. Jonathan Gottschall says, "We are soaked to the bone in story." I am going to propose that it's in our bones, it's in our blood, it's in our muscles, it's in the neurons that are firing in our heads. Story is your native language, whether you realize it or not. And we're gonna do a little experiment right now. Does that sound good? That is our tall tale. Story Matters, BYU TV, if you want to see it again or hear more of it, share it with your family, community group, whatever. Okay, here's an experiment. I just want you to watch a little film, and then I'm going to ask you some questions afterwards, okay? Okay. Somebody tell me what you just saw. Yeah.
There's two kids, and the principal took something from them, and so then they had to get it back, so they had a decoy plan where he goes in there, and then the other one comes in and sneaks it, and then they run off with whatever the principal.
Okay, nice. I like that. Anybody else? What'd you see? Anyone? Yeah.
So two kids, one kid gets, oh, sorry, microphone. a kid bullying another kid, and then there's another kid that's like an observer, and then they kind of work together to defeat the bully, I guess.
Get away from the bully. Okay. Anybody else? See something different? Yeah.
I saw a parent trying to take a good nap. Two kids, definitely we're not going to let that nap happen, and now the house is breaking up.
Nice. Okay, this is really interesting. I do this little film for, probably a couple hundred teachers every year. And we see some themes that come across when we do this, right? One of them is the bully. One of them is the bully on the playground. What I saw was a mother protecting her offspring. I saw it as a mother bird, right? Protecting her offspring from a predator bird. The other one that comes up on a regular basis is a lover protecting his partner from an aggressive interloper. That happens sometimes. This is actually a real research experiment that was done by Fritz Heidler and Marianne Simler, I think is her name, in the 1940s. So they created this film and they showed it to 114 adults. And all but 3 of those 114 adults did exactly what you guys did. They took these images and they created a story out of it, oftentimes a battle between good and evil, right? The big story. Those other 3 gave the only rational, logical answer to this question. What did you see? Oh, here we go. Well, it's going to play out before I let me do it. The only logical answer, a bunch of random shapes moving around a 2-dimensional plane. That's it. But what did your brain do when you saw those random shapes moving around a 2-dimensional plane? What did it do? Created a story, right? I just put my notes on my phone, so excuse me for the phone. I love this because it kind of proves that quote by Jonathan Gottschall, right? We are soaked to the bone in story. I didn't tell you to make a story out of that. And no one does when they do this experiment. What they do is ask you what you saw. You have very limited information about what this is, right? I gave you 0 information. All you had was what was on the screen. And your brain filled in the information that you didn't have. And almost universally, what human brains do when they're lacking information is they take what they have and make a story out of it. A couple quotes from people. Dr. Mark Turner, who's at Case Western Reserve University, he says, "Story is a basic principle of the mind. Most of our experience, our knowledge, and our thinking is organized as stories." The image that I think when I'm thinking about that organizational system is like a file cabinet, right? And what our brain does is it takes our experiences or our knowledge and it puts them in files called stories. And then it organizes those stories, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about that later and how stories actually make that information so memorable, because there are things going on inside your brain. Dan Kahneman, who is a behavioral economist, author of Thinking Fast and Slow, said this: "You cannot help dealing with the limited information you have as if it is all there is to know. You build the best possible story from the information available to you, and if it is a good story, you believe it." If it's a good story, you believe it. Now, most of you, I think, in this room are students, professors, there's probably a few others. Most of you are doing research, correct? Do you have a reason you're doing that research? Is there something that you want people to understand about your research? Most of the people that you need to understand your research probably are not going to be researchers. They might not be soaked in data the way that you are soaked in data, or statistical analysis the way that you are in statistical analysis. If you want them to understand, and oftentimes those are the people who can take your data and make policy decisions and make decisions about how your data goes out and makes impact in the world, if you want them to understand it, tell a story. tell a compelling story that gives to the truth of what you're researching, of the impact that you want to make in the world. Let's talk a little bit about why that is so effective, shall we? We're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience first. And I am not a neuroscientist, I won't claim to be, but I have done a little bit of looking into this, and I want to talk a little bit about how this works. And I think there's three main things. You'll see four up here, but two of them are kind of connected. And so I'm going to talk about three main things. One is kind of the mirror neurons, or I like to think of it as like an empathy system or a built-in virtual reality system in your brain. And that goes along with this idea of like the dopamine, oxytocin, adrenaline that happens in our brains. Another is the idea of neural coupling. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then just the basic idea of how much of your brain gets involved when you're hearing a compelling story. So let's start a little bit with mirror neurons. So there were some Italian researchers in the 90s, and they were studying primate brains to try and figure out kind of how our brains work, right? And basically they hooked a monkey up to a bunch of sensors on their brain and were recording the brain activity in this monkey's brain when it was just doing various things, like eating. So the monkey eats a peanut, and there's brain activity, right? Its brain does something, and they record it. Now, I don't know if this is how the story really went, but I heard it told it this way, and I think it's a great story, so I'm going to tell it. And you guys can just understand that it gets to the truth of the story. So one day, they're in the lab, the researcher's watching the monkey, recording the brain stuff. Another researcher comes in. At that time, the monkey's eating a bowl of peanuts, okay? Other researcher comes in, has a little conversation with the guy who's working on the monkey, and in the midst of that conversation, he grabs those peanuts from the monkey and he starts eating, right? The monkey's watching him eat the peanuts now. They go back and look over their research from that day and the brain activity from that day, and guess what they find about that moment when the monkey was watching the other scientist eat his peanuts? What do you think happened to the brain activity there? What's that?
It was similar.
It was not only similar, it was the same. The brain activity, there were no significant differences between the brain activity when the monkey is eating the peanut and when the monkey is watching someone else eat the peanut. Now, this research is still pretty new, and there's lots of stuff that you can go online and find about it, and there's some controversies that rage, as everybody does. But it indicates that there are structures in primate brains where the visual image of something has the same effect on your brain as the actual action of doing that thing, okay? Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to give you a quiz. I do this with elementary school kids all the time, and when I say I give you a quiz, they go, ah. And I say, it's okay, it's the easiest quiz you ever take. It's multiple choice, there's only 2 answers, and both of them can be right, okay? So, I want you to go back to the story that Bill Left just told. I don't want you to think about the story. This time I want you to think about what was happening inside your head as Bill was telling the story, okay? Multiple choice. A is, I was thinking about every word and how that word related to every other word and what those words altogether meant. Or, answer B is, I began to have a picture form in my head, almost like a movie, almost like a film inside my head. A's. Any A's thinking about the word? This is pretty common. Usually in a room this size, I might get 1 or 2 people who say I was thinking about the words. Those are usually writers. But how many of you are B? I began to have pictures of 2 teenagers in the cab of a truck with very realistic deer heads on. Almost universally, when I ask that, people say they get pictures inside of your head. Now, combine that with what I've just told you about mirror neurons. What's happening inside your head and inside your body when you're hearing a compelling story? Let me ask you another question. Any of you like scary stories? This is so funny. When I asked this to a room full of 4th graders, like, oh yeah! And the adults are always like, no, I know too much about the world. There are real scary things in the world. Okay, how about action stories? Like action films, car chases, that kind of thing. Any of you like romance stories? Ah, nice. There's always a few who will admit it. So here's my question. Let's take that car chase action film scenario, okay? Have you ever watched someone who is watching a car chase in a story? What happens to them physically as they're watching a car chase? Yeah?
I feel like I'm looking at my nephews right now as I see this, and also in myself, because I've caught myself acting this out too, but my head kind of actually gets lower and I get like way focused on the scene and analyzing every little thing that's happening because I practically have immersed myself into the action.
Yes. Now this is what's interesting. Whether you're hearing a great story with these action kinds of elements, or whether you're watching a car chase on the screen, if you watch someone as they go around a corner in a car chase, what does that person do? Ooh, right? They go around the other corner. They go the other way. If they stop quickly, what do? Oh, right now, you're at a sleepover and you're 10 years old or whatever, and someone's telling ghost stories. What happens to you physically as you're hearing that ghost story well after midnight in the dark of the basement in your neighbor's house? Tell me what happens physically. You tense?
Yeah.
Get a little white knuckled, right? Your heart starts pumping, there's a little bit of adrenaline, right? You are in a climate-controlled, parentally supervised situation. There is no axe murderer coming after you, right? And yet, when you're hearing that compelling story, your brain kicks in that virtual reality system. Those pictures inside your head convince your body that you are actually experiencing what you're hearing. And so the adrenaline comes in, the fight or flight comes in, and you tense. And your heart starts pumping blood because your body thinks, I might have to get away from an axe murderer at any second, right? This is the power of story. Romance works too. If you think about hearing a romantic story when the lovers finally overcome all the challenges and are about to kiss for the first time, if you are immersed in that story, your body is going to have some similar reactions to what your body has when you kiss your own lover, right? You're likely to blush. You're likely to get the butterflies in the stomach. That feeling of kind of joy, right? That's why we watch romances. That's why we watch horror, because they're so good at giving us a virtual experience. A well-told story is the same way. You can actually physically move people in a well-told story. You can change the way they think, and you can change the way they feel. That's mirror neurons for you and that chemical aspect of it. Neural coupling, there's a guy named Yuri Hassan. I might be saying his name wrong. I can never remember how you say it. He's a researcher at Princeton University. His body of work is about communication and how communication works in our brain. You can find a great TED Talk from him if you're interested in this. He's also got a ton of his research online. Interesting guy. So he wanted to do an experiment that kind of would look into the effects of story on communication. So he took a bunch of research subjects, put them in a functional MRI machine, was paying attention to what their brains were doing. Now, before the experiment starts, they're just sitting in the MRI machine, waiting, for whatever to happen, and their brain activity is all over the map, right? All over the map. Then he takes a storyteller, actually from The Moth, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with The Moth, if you've heard it before. Takes a great storyteller from The Moth and starts pumping that story that he's telling into all of these research subjects. Almost immediately, a very interesting thing happens. Their brain activity syncs up, right? Everybody's brain starts following the same pattern, with the exception of a very few people who are about a second ahead of everybody else. Now, as researchers, there's all kinds of explanations for all kinds of things, so they start paring down the explanations. And they did the story in a different language to see what was happening. And the auditory parts of the brain were syncing, right? Because they're hearing the same stuff. They took the story apart and put the sentences out of order to see what would happen. And the auditory and the language processing parts of the brain were good. They're all together and everything else is not necessarily. But when they are hearing a cohesive, compelling story, it gets into the deeper parts of your brain. all of a sudden you've got your prefrontal cortex that's in sync with everybody else. You've got your hippocampus, which is hugely involved in the creation of memory. I'm going to say it wrong, I always do. Amygdala, is that how you say that part of the brain? Your amygdala, the seat of your emotions. Your motor cortex, that's controlling movement. All of the parts of the brain that are responding to your senses, your sensory perception. When you hear a well-told story, it's pulling in and drawing in all of those different parts of the brain, which is where we get to this third part. When you are processing facts and information, like bulleted lists, right? Statistical data, that kind of thing, pretty much two parts of your brain get involved, Broca and Wernicke's area, which are involved in language production and comprehension. When you get a well-told story that is creating pictures inside of your head, any part of your brain can get involved. Any part of your brain that storyteller can touch with their words or their gestures or whatever they're using, that part of the brain gets involved. And when that happens, things stick. You remember, right? You don't just remember the story, but you remember what you learned and what you thought as a result of that story. That is powerful, okay? If you go back to the chemicals, if you think about the times in your life that you would say, I will never forget that. My guess is that was an emotional experience, right? That was an experience that released some dopamine or some oxytocin or some adrenaline into your brain. And that's an interesting thing, because if you can use those sensory details and story structures to get to those parts of the brain that are receptive to that kind of thing, it's like, you remember that file system that we talked about? That file cabinet that takes all of your information and your memories and puts them into files and stories? If they can get to that part of your brain, if they can get to the part of your brain that's emotional, it's like putting a big old neon stick-it note on there in bold letters saying, remember this. Could that be useful in your work, in your life? I know it could be in mine, and that's why we do what we do. Because we want to make your life a little bit easier. What time are we at? Do we know?
About 12, 13 minutes.
Okay, good deal. I'm just gonna, let's talk about narrative identity.
So we have these stories that we grew up with about
There he is. We're actually gonna skip the film, although it's pretty awesome. A little bit about the psychology. There's a guy at Northwestern University named Dan McAdams who studies the psychology of storytelling, and kind of one of the things that he's figured out are these two concepts of narrative identity and narrative choice. And basically narrative identity is that idea that you take the incomplete information of the experiences of your life, because none of us actually remember things how they actually happened. We remember how we perceive them or how we experience them. So you take those events, and out of the big events of your life, the happy, the sad, the tragic, those big events, you create a myth of your own life and your own identity, right? And then the way you choose to tell that story, the way you choose to make sense of those experiences through story, actually influences the way you move through your life from that point on. Let me give you an example. When I was a little girl, probably about maybe 7 years old, there was another little girl who was younger. She was like a toddler in our neighborhood. And they were driving along I-15, and somehow this little girl managed to get herself out of her seatbelt and got the door of their van open. And she fell out. And she was, the injuries were fairly minor considering the situation. She had some broken bones and some road rash bruises and that sort of thing. But of course, in a ward, news gets around, as you know. And my parents were talking about that this had happened to this little girl. And at some point they looked over at me and they saw that I was crying. And they're like, Marilee, what's wrong? What's wrong? And I said, I don't know, I just feel so bad for this little girl. And I'm just bawling. And my sweet dad said to me, oh, Marilee, you have such a tender heart, right? And that's a story that I remember from my childhood. And it's one that has affected the way I thought about myself. I think that I am a sensitive person, not only to my own issues, but that I'm sensitive to other people, that I have some bit of empathy, and that is a good thing in my life. And it's changed the way that I act as I move forward into my life, because in order to maintain that identity, I actually have to be tenderhearted and have to be compassionate and have empathy for people. Sometimes I'm better at it than in others. But when I look back at that moment and think about the narrative choice that happened there, both between my father and I, my dad could have made a very different decision about how he reacted to that. He's a football coach, right? He's a big guy. He is all about strength, right? And in that moment, instead of praising me for tenderheartedness and making that narrative choice of how he perceived that story, he could have said, "You are so weak. What is wrong with you? Nothing's wrong with you. Stop crying," right? And that totally changes my narrative identity if I choose to incorporate that into my own sense of self, right? Another thing, I talk about this with teachers all the time. When I was student teaching, I was a high school English teacher for 3 years at the beginning of my career. It killed me. But when I was student teaching at a school up in Cache Valley, there was this kid in my class, 15-year-old, ne'er-do-well, bless his heart, big, bushy, blonde hair, always had a black hat, turned crooked, brought a skateboard into class every single day, and this was the kid that could not find the line unless he stepped over it. Every single time, right? And I was frustrated. I was a young teacher. I had no idea what I was doing, and it was just probably one of the hardest parts of my life. But I was so frustrated with this kid. I didn't even want him to learn at that point. I just wanted one day where I didn't feel like I had to send him to the principal for being sexist, racist, hateful. It was really hard. And I had created this narrative of this kid that he was just bad and was always going to be bad. And it was not a good narrative choice that I made. A little while later in the faculty room, I brought that up, that I'm really frustrated with this kid, what should I do? And of course, small town, everybody knew everybody, they knew his family, all of that kind of stuff. They told me a story about his mom, and deciding to make that narrative choice to trust that narrative brought me to a whole other identity for this kid and our relationship. Also not a good one. But I look back at that now and I think, had I understood a little bit more about how stories can affect the way we think about ourselves and others and how we feel in those situations, I would have made a very different narrative choice. And that could have changed that relationship significantly and could have primed that student for success. There's all kinds of situations in your life where you can think about narrative identity and narrative choice. A question, if someone asked you today, why do you do what you do? You're making a narrative choice when you answer that question. And honestly, if you're doing it right, you're telling a story about who you are and who you want to be and how you want the world to be. Narrative identity and narrative choice. Before we go, and I know we don't have much time left, but I want to give you a really quick, if you're going to be able to make this work in your life, you're going to have to be able to tell compelling stories. And so really fast lesson on how do we build a story, okay? We have a storyteller named Donald Davis, and he structures it this way, and I think it's great, a great way to structure. First thing, you got to know where you are, and you got to know who's there, right? Now this is where you start to bring in some of those sensory details. This is when you want to describe things in ways that are going to connect with your listeners. Sensory details are important. A leathery hand is a way better image, a way better feeling. They're more likely to feel a leathery hand than his skin was really hard and dry, okay? Good details draw out all those brain things that are happening. So we take the people and the places and we make them real in a picture inside someone's head by giving them good sensory details. Don't over detail. Do you know somebody who tells a story that takes 14 million days because they tell you everything about everyone in the story? Don't do that. You'll know the right detail because you'll see people light up. You'll see that they know somebody like that. You hit the detail that they can connect. Donald talks about how a parable is not a story that teaches. A parable is actually a story that draws out a story of your own that you would not have remembered unless you had heard the first story. So find those details that draw other people's stories and experiences out. Now, when we've got the people and places where we are and who the people are and we're figuring out what they're like when it's normal, the thing you got to bring in is some trouble. Maybe. Speaking of trouble. The other part of it is to create a problem. Without a problem, without trouble, there's not a story, and no one's gonna care. Trouble is what caused people to wonder, well, what happened next, right? So take them from this is what it's like when it's all normal to this is what's happening, the trouble that's stirring that up. The other part of problem is the progress, and I like to think of progress in terms of change. When I do this with kids, with students, I make them repeat with me. You need people in interesting places who learn by dealing with their problems, or who change, make progress by dealing with their problems. That's a story. It's a simple structure. You can do it in one line, or you can do it in a 50-minute professional storytelling performance. But if you can begin to create compelling stories based on your research, based on your personal life, based on folk tales or fables, you're going to have that power that we talked about before, to get inside someone's head with an ancient virtual reality system that can give you the opportunity to help them think the way you think and feel the way you feel and make decisions going forward in ways that will make them more informed and better decision makers. I don't know how much time we have left. Any questions that you have for me? I talked a lot, sorry. I usually like having other people talk a little more, but yeah.
Could you say the name was,
Donald Davis. Donald Davis, and if you want to see him perform, he's got a couple of stories on that BYU TV Story Matters. In addition, I'll just give you a little plug, he is going to do a free holiday performance at the City Library up in Salt Lake, Monday, December 10th at 7 o'clock. So if you want to see him live, he's fantastic. Some really hilarious holiday stories. Take a break out of your own holiday troubles to hear the Davis family holiday troubles. Any other questions? Thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I hope that it was valuable to you.